Hey everyone, I wanted to send out a quick video to talk about the second half of our class as we turn towards a little more practical application. So, we've done some theoretical work, talked about just war theory, pacifism, and nonviolence, and then peace building or just peacemaking. Cahill's word peace building, and then Thistlethwaite using Glenn Stasson's just peacemaking idea. So, we've kind of this has all been in context of kind of wars and international conflict. What I want to do is begin to transition in such a way that we can start taking some of these ideas that we're looking at, and we can begin to principalize them, and then move them into other conversations besides international conflict. So if you think back to our conversation on moral norms and why we did so much work on those, including with the film Weapons of the Spirit, and then talking about the different types of moral norms, what you saw were different ways that we can look at specific rules, what are behind the rules, like the principles, what are behind some of the principles in the basic convictions, how do we develop these kinds of particular immediate judgments so we respond in the correct way given a kind of ethical or moral dilemma or crisis. And Lisa Cahill talked about that when it comes to war and pacifism, even that you cannot avoid moral crises and moral dilemmas. And so how do we kind of think about these things in that way? And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to take the 10 practices of just peacemaking and kind of principalize them. They are principles in some way, but they're also meant to be very practical, in Glenn's words, grace-based initiatives towards peace. And remember, we're not talking about the kind of peace, the minimal layer of peace that we're talking about is no violence. But we're talking about more than that. We're talking about the biblical picture of flourishing, of shalom, of when the New Testament uses peace. And so we're talking about more than just the absence of conflict. We're talking about a kind of life where human beings can flourish in the way that God intended them to. And we'll look at that a little bit more in an article I wrote on John and Genesis and the gospel. What does abundant life mean in the gospel? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in coming weeks. But what I wanted to do is take the 10 practices of peacemaking, and I want to kind of principalize some of them, because you may be asking the question, well, how does this apply to, like, say, racial conflict in America or in the West? How does it apply to presidential conflicts, those kinds of things? How does it, political conflicts, how does it apply to other places of conflict that aren't necessarily international, may not include weapons, but are preventing people from flourishing nonetheless? So let me try to do this with the 10 practices of peacemaking. The first three: support nonviolent direct action, taking independent initiatives to reduce the threat, and using cooperative conflict resolution. Those seem like they can translate on a one-to-one basis. That when you have a conflict, to move into an area to try to reduce the conflict through some kind of direct action is important. To identify the threat, what is causing harm, what do people feel vulnerable by, and then taking some initiatives to reduce that seems like comparable as well. And then, of course, using cooperative conflict resolution applies to interpersonal relationships as well as international relationships. Actually, Glenn was drawing from personal relationships and applying that to international relationships. So those first three seem pretty self-explanatory to me. Principle number 4, or practice number 4, is acknowledging responsibility for conflict and injustice and seeking repentance and forgiveness. This also seems decently comparable in the sense that when we're in a conflict, to recognize our responsibility for the conflict, how we're contributing to it, or we've contributed to an injustice, and to confess and seek repentance, and then forgive and seek forgiveness, is an important part of conflict resolution. It's a little bit more difficult in international contexts. It's a little difficult in public context and group context, but it's an important process, an important part of moving towards one another, which you're reading about in Exclusion and Embrace by Miroslav Volf. What does it mean to embrace, to move towards an other? And so let me give you an example on this one. I've been asked to speak on several controversial topics at Stanford University as a part of the religious life community here. And I was asked early on in 2004 to speak on same-sex marriage in the context of Massachusetts passing the first law in the U.S. To allow same-sex marriage. And so the first thing that I did was to confess how the church has treated LGBTQ plus persons in the past, how they've done injustices, how they've prohibited housing, how they've kind of prevented some of the basic human rights that people need to flourish because of a person's sexuality or sexual orientation. So the first thing I did was confess that and acknowledge that we have done that, and I mentioned a couple of specific cases, and then and ask for forgiveness. That was my first part of my public lecture on that part, and that seemed to take some of the heat out of the room and begin a different kind of conversation. So acknowledging responsibility for conflict and injustice, confession, repentance, and seeking forgiveness. The fifth one, advancing democracy and human rights. So we'll probably have to tease this one out in a principle form in personal conflict or group conflict. We're not going to just establish a democracy in a small group or something like that. But what we can say is that when you're in conflict with another person, or in a church setting or in a public setting, that everybody has a voice and feels heard. That's one big step towards making peace, that everybody has a voice and feels heard. And it's especially true when it comes to their basic needs. So if somebody is not getting their basic needs met and they don't feel heard, that's going to produce conflict. So that's how you kind of principalize advancing democracy and human rights. The sixth one, fostering just and sustainable economic development. People need to know that they have a future. And part of that future is that they have the money that they need or will need to flourish and for their families to flourish. And so we want to make sure that the economic scales are bending towards people that don't have their basic needs met, so that everybody kind of feels a sense that whatever they have and how we distribute our money is a very personal thing. So socialism never works in the sense of everything is equal always. As soon as somebody equalizes something, I may exchange my money for a different good than another person will exchange their money. A good example is our family. We tend to pay money for experiences. And so we'll take our children on experiences, we'll pay them. Another side of our family, they like to save their money for the future. And so we'll have less money than them if we're given equal money within a month or two, because we'll spend our money in experiences. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So fostering just and sustainable economic development, having people can see that they'll have enough for the future. The seventh one, work with emerging cooperative forces in the international community, and then support the UN. Those two kind of go together, and I think the principle for that one is that third parties can help and authorities can help. So somebody who's outside of the conflict can help you adjudicate and help you understand and realize and develop some self-awareness where you might be wrong or where the other person might be wrong, or where you might want the same things, but you are going about it a different kind of way. So third parties can help. Sometimes authorities can help as well to settle a conflict. The ninth one, reduce offensive weapons and the weapons trade. So, usually we're not using weapons in these interpersonal conflicts, and sometimes that happens and we need to reduce them. But what we want to identify is what is used to harm another, and then how can we reduce that. So it may be the language that we use, or it may be an economic system that's present, or something like that, or a judicial system that's present. And so we want to identify that, what's used to harm others, and then how can we reduce that. And then finally, number 10 is encouraging grassroots peacemaking groups. And that one is also pretty self-explanatory. We can bring together small groups of people that want to work towards peace from inside each community, and then they can help their communities understand what the other communities. So we're not getting everybody together, but we're getting a small group together of these grassroots peacemaking groups, and they're having conversations on how to do this because they're the most motivated by it. And so then they'll take it back to their communities and help their communities in that. So I'm taking these kind of just peacemaking practices and I'm trying to principalize them so that we can apply them into different situations. It doesn't always have to be international conflict that we're addressing. It can be conflicts within your church. It can be interpersonal conflicts. It can be political conflicts, those kinds of things, or public conflicts. So all these can be applied in some way. So I just wanted to kind of bring those 10 practices into that conversation a little bit as we move towards the back half of the class, and especially as you move towards your group project where you'll be given a particular conflict that's happening right now, presently, and you're going to be able to try to articulate both sides of the narrative of that conflict, and then how do you apply some of these peacemaking practices and peace building practices, and how do you apply Miroslav Wolf's principles of embrace into this context. And so so hopefully that's helpful for you all. I'm going to do a couple more videos. One is how to understand Wolf, especially his 4 movements of embrace. So we're going to kind of tease that out a little bit and add some texture to that, because I think it's a really profound. The most profound part of his book is those 4 movements of embrace. Okay, so have a great week this week, and I look forward to reading your reflections on exclusion and embrace.